Even before the ink was dry on the designs for the M3 medium, in August of 1940, Ordnance told the designers to get started on the replacement vehicle, but this happened in February of 41 simply because they were too busy putting the finishing touches onto the M3. The resulting product was manufactured in September of 41. It was the medium tank T6. The remit the designers were given was pretty simple. Put the 75mm into a rotating turret, and make the tank smaller than the M3. The T6 showed up at Aberdeen for testing. It was a strange combination of the archaic and the modern. Certainly the stabilized gun and the synchromesh transmission showed promise. On the other hand, you still had something that had fixed forward-firing machine guns, and it had all of 4 hatches for the 5 crewmen. 2 of those hatches were in the hull sides. The first of the production M4A1s was built in the Lima Locomotive Works in February 1942. This was sent to Aberdeen Proving Grounds to work out some of the bugs. They were built to a British contract. The second tank was sent to the United Kingdom for testing. It was named Michael, possibly after Michael Dewar, the head of the British tank mission in the US. That tank can still be seen today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, still in a shiny gloss green with the fixed forward-firing machine guns. As such, it is the oldest surviving Sherman tank. We're going to move forward a little bit to August of 43 though, and the reason we're going to do this is that's when the Montreal Locomotive Works ceased production of the Ram and started production of the Grizzly. Now the Grizzly is basically an M4A1 built with a couple of local tweaks in Canada. Most of the 188 Grizzlies that were manufactured did not see combat. As a result, they generally survived the war. Thus, most of the M4A1s you see in private hands or in museums today are actually Grizzlies, which have been backdated to look like an American M4. This vehicle behind me here at the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation, Portola Valley, California, is indeed one of these Grizzlies and will be the subject of our tour, which will of course happen in the usual manner: outside first, engine, and then in part 2 we go inside. Pleasantries out of the way, let's get going. Now we're going to start off with the first elephant. This particular M4 has been parked in between its 2 close contemporaries, the T-34-76 on one side, the Panzer IV on the other. And immediately you'll see that this tank is not the smallest of the 3. Most of this extra height is in the hull. The turrets are pretty much equivalent. Now you may at first think this is actually a good thing because you've got more room, you've got more comfortable positions for the crew, you've got more stowage, you also have a bigger target. Now the reason this was done is located to the left here. The engine in the tank is mounted pretty much the same way as it is on this stand, except a slight forward angle to allow the power shaft to go under the turret basket. It's a tall engine, you need a tall engine bay. But the other advantage to the tall engine bay is that you can fit a whole variety of engines into this one tank, which is applicable considering the American manufacturing capability of the time. Moving to the hull, the cast hull marks this as an M4A1. Welded hull variants were simple M4s. Now there was a composite or hybrid version that had a cast front and a welded back. The US Army categorized those as plain M4s. The armour is about 2 inches thick, starts at about 37 degrees, goes up to about 55 at the top, giving it an effective thickness of between 2.5 to 3.5 inches. On a welded hull Sherman, that 2-inch plate is at an even 57. This, if you count the slope, is a better part of 3.5 inches, and it compares quite favourably to, say, the T-34, and better than most of the German tanks. There are, however, 2 small catches. Those are the bulges for the driver and the bow gunner. These are weak points. Surprise, surprise. So what they ended up doing was welding. You'll often see a lot of times a piece of sheet metal welded in front of these bulges to give a little bit of extra protection. Now the other catch with this is what you could call a small hatch Sherman. The early versions, because they had that steep slope, didn't have much room on the roof of the hull to allow the hatch. So the hatches on the early versions were very small. The earliest M4s actually came with a direct vision port in the bulge itself, but that was soon deleted. Moving on to the components, we're going to start off with the most important part of the tank. No, it's not the gun, at least not in this case. Now if you think about it, it's a small quirk of geography. Unlike most of the other combatants, the US was separated from the rest of the world and the fighting by a couple of small bodies of water called the Atlantic and the Pacific. This meant that you had to get whatever it was you built in Ohio and in Detroit and Wisconsin and everywhere else that they were making tanks from the US to, say, Europe on a ship. To get it onto the ship, you had to lift it up. We didn't have back then the roll-on, roll-off ships that we're familiar with today. You actually had to get a crane, hook onto the lifting eyes, lift it up, put it over and down into the hold. Now your next catch is that most of the cranes of the time had a weight limit, and a lot of that weight limit was frequently 40 ton. Which basically put an upper end limit. You could build a heavy tank in the US, but if most of your ship cranes or most of your land cranes couldn't lift it in and out of the ship, it's not going to do you a heck of a lot of good. So that was why the American heavy tank never really found great favor. Now there were other problems with them as well. The M6 Heavy, for example, was mechanically unreliable, god-awful huge and ugly and whatever. But by and large, the Americans pinned their flag to the medium tank, and of course the lights. As we move on a little bit, we have the brush guards covering the service lights and marker lights, another brush guard for the siren, and we have a G stamp for General Steel. Now General Steel were basically a subcontractor. If memory serves, was about 4,237 parts in an M4A4, and about 80 of them were subcontractors. Now, this meant that General Steel, we were of course in the US, were shipping these castings to Montreal for final production. As we move further on, we go to the three-piece transmission housing. Now, of course, later on he ended up with single piece and then finally the shark nose, but all the Grizzlies were made as near as we can tell with the three-piece. This is one of the later versions of the three-piece though, because you have this little lip protecting the bolts. The idea of the bolts, well, simple enough. If you have to change out the transmission or something like that, you simply unbolt this, hook up a crane, pull off the housing, there's your transmission right in front of you. It took about 2 hours to change a transmission, which by the standards of the time, especially if you compare it to the Panther we did before, is pretty quick. The bolts were originally open and exposed and susceptible to enemy fire, which meant that when you had to quickly change the transmission, you had to spend half the time just shearing off the bolt. So this lip was added for protection. By the end of Sherman's production run though, the housing completely encased the bolt. The bolt was in a recess and thus much more protected. Now, while I'm here, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. I was having a chat once on the phone with Tom Yentz, who made me feel like I knew absolutely nothing. But he postulated to me that Sherman's reputation for reliability was overstated, and that in fact it was not any more reliable than any other tank of the time. Which of course raises an eyebrow, because we all know that Sherman was praised for its reliability. And to some extent it was. I mean, you compare it with the early Cromwells, for example, yeah, it definitely was. But compared to other in-service vehicles, I have never actually done a per-mile breakdown rate assessment. The way he put it was, and I think he might have been onto something, the reliability of Sherman came from the operational readiness rate. When a commander said, tomorrow morning we're going to attack with my 100 tanks, how many of them would actually cross the start line? And it would be 99 or 100 tanks. And the reason they could do that was because of the maintainability of the tank. There is a couple of features here. So firstly, you've already mentioned how quickly it is to exchange parts. The second thing is that the Americans bought spare parts, and they brought a lot of them. Unlike, say, the Germans, where units would be fighting each other at the train depot to get a part, Americans had spare parts coming out the wazoo. I mean, they basically have entire tanks in individual component form sitting in the warehouses. So we have to repair a tank. Let's say the transmission needs replacing. Pull off the housing. Go get a spare part. Bring the spare part back, plug it in, it will fit perfectly. Because American parts were built to high design tolerances. If you saw like a vise or other fitting materials on the workbench, it was a sign of incompetence. Because if you did your job right the first time, the part fit. So you now have this part that fits, goes right in, you close up the transmission housing, you're done in 2 hours, you can go on to the next tank. So you could change 3 Sherman transmissions in, say, the same amount of time would it take you to do 1 Panther. Put that way, I think he very well may have a point. Now, again, I have not done the per-mile reliability assessment rating checks. If anybody out there on the web has done so or can link to them, please put it in the comments. I'll be curious to see the results. Other features on the front, that little tangent over. The gun crutch, aka travel lock. Gun crutch, of course, is what the English will call it. And the bow 30 caliber machine gun. That's the front. That didn't take too long. Let's go around the side. So as you come around to the side of the tank, you see that the running gear is pretty much taken straight off of the M3 medium. But there are a couple of minor differences. The tracks are not one of them. They're the same 16 and 9/16 of an inch wide. They came in a smorgasbord of variations. I'm not going to go list them all right now, but I am going to mention the Canadian dry pin. CDP was a shorter pitched track. There were more links per side, meant that you had to have more teeth on the sprocket wheel. So if you're looking at a Sherman and you see that there seems to be a rather inordinate amount of teeth on the sprocket, the chances are you're dealing with a Commonwealth vehicle. Obviously the Canadians like CDP the most, but I do believe that the British use them as well. Now the problem with the narrow track also carries on from the M3 medium. The thinking behind it is if you have a small narrow track, there's less weight of metal that you got to haul around, your tank will go faster. Which is fine on hard surface, not so fantastic if you're going around in the mud in Russia. So, some workarounds were developed. The first workaround was a simple duck bill. This is an extended end connector. There's basically a little plate that comes out a couple inches, gives you a little bit more surface area in contact with the ground. If this wasn't enough, you could then move to the Easy 9 suspension. And what this was there was a spacer that you will put in between the bogie and the hull side. It will shove the bogie out about 6 inches, and there's another advantage to the modularity of the bogie system. You then had enough room to mount additional extended end connectors on the inside of the track, and this really did increase the flotation capability of the vehicle. One of these E9s is still visible at the National World War II Museum down in New Orleans, if you happen to be down that way and want to look it up. The bogies were originally the light-duty version, or at least what we would now know as light-duty. The return roller was up top and center. In the middle of 1942, they changed. They moved the roller to the rear, and that's your visual identifier. They replaced it with a metal skid, and that design kind of tweaked a little bit over time. But most importantly was they increased the diameter of the springs under here from 7 inches to 8 inches, making them a lot more durable. The whole system would span a 7.5-foot trench. It would climb a 24-inch wall. And you look at the M10 that we did before, and that would only scale an 18-inch wall. Why the difference? Because the running gear is the same. As near as I can tell, it's a matter of weight. The M4 had a little bit more weight pushing down on the track and gave you a little bit more grip. The last thing I'll mention while we're on the subject of running gear is the gap in between the bogies. Now, on most M4s, the spacing between the wheels is pretty much the same as you have here. The exception is the M4A4. This had a longer engine. The entire hull needed to be extended, which meant that the bogies were spread out a bit further. So an M4A4 would have a gap between the bogies maybe the size of an additional road wheel. The primary user of the M4A4 was the British. There was also the M4A6, but you almost never see any of those. As we move up a little bit, just forward, there's a mount for either a radio antenna, or if there's no radio because it's not a command tank, a ventilator. And then we moved to the sponson where much of the ammunition was stowed. This is actually in common with a lot of other tanks, despite the reputation that M4 had for burning. It was indeed the ammunition that was the cause, not the petrol. And there were a couple of different solutions proposed. Eventually, of course, wet stowage, but the interim solution was applique armour. You simply put more armour between the guys shooting at you and the ammo. Whether or not it actually did sufficient amounts of use is another matter. But so they put the applique anyway, and then he put a nice big white helpful aiming mark so that the gunners could still get their detonations anyway. As you move further up, you'll see a lot of Shermans will have similar applique armour on the front of the turret. The reason this was done was that in order to make room for the gun control equipment on the inside of the tank, they had to shave out some of the metal of the wall of the turret. This meant that you had thin armour now, between the outside world and the gunner and the TC. The long-term solution was a new casting of the turret. You will see some turrets that actually have a bulge cast into it. The short-term solution was just, from the factory, additional plates of applique armour that would be simply welded to the side. So now we come to the back of the tank, where ordinarily I talk about track tension. And I'm not going to do it this time. Half of you going, hooray! And the reason for this is exactly the same as you saw on the M3 Medium and the M10 Tank Destroyer. It's the big wrench, the big bolt. That's as far as I'll go with that. Instead, I will mention the engine, the Wright Whirlwind R975. When we first encountered this engine in the M3 Medium, it was rated by the manual at 400 horsepower, running a higher octane level of fuel. In this installation though, the manual rates it as only 350 horsepower running on 80 octane. Now the engine had a couple of quirks. Now the first one was its tendency to over-rev. I was talking with a driver of the time, and he said that the problem was, in times when you really needed the power, like somebody's shooting at you and you want to go somewhere really quickly, you didn't think too much about the engine, you just put your foot down, the engine would rev up, and then you had a good chance of blowing the engine. The other problem, being a radial engine, is that you have to hand crank the thing, because all the fluids, the oils, will all settle into the bottom cylinders and you end up with a hydrostatic lock. As a result, if you have a cold engine, you gotta turn it over, hence turning over the engine. And to do that, you use the hand crank, which is simple enough. Insert it into this little hole back here. The M18 gun motor carriage, the Hellcat, had the same thing. Just feed it through, it hooks in to a little notch in there, and you can then start cranking 60 times before the engine is considered to be suitably rotated and you can start it up. Now, to give you a better idea as to what's going on back here, let's move over to the demonstrator model we have around the corner. So now we have the demonstrator model. You can see the aiming mark that's on the inside of the tank, and you can also see from the bar just how deep inside it is. Fit it into the notch, start cranking, you'll start seeing the radiator fans turning on the far side. I'm not going to do it all 60 times. So that's done. Let's put this right back in. Now, of course, you wouldn't have to do this if the engine was warm, but still, I've no doubt that the crew is very happy to get engines a little bit more modern later on in the war, that you didn't have to do this every time. Again, the M18 gun motor carriage, you still had to have the radial engine. While I'm back here, the other two things you'll see here, it's the large air filters and the exhaust ports. And the cooling air would be blasted through the big gap in between the whole roof and the back wall. It'd be deflected downwards right into the dust and dirt, just what you didn't want to have, signifying your position to anybody within miles in North Africa's desert. There were also sand shields. You'll see on the side of the hull, the holes for the mounting of the sand shields, they did not last very long. Once they were broken off, nobody ever bothered trying to repair them. So getting up, this is not the hardest tank to get up of. You got good handholds, and of course you can use the bogies. So now we're up here, we can start talking about the different engine deck variants. M4s and M4A1s with the Continental Radial, they had an engine deck similar to this with an armoured intake up the front and no grille further back. The M4A2 was the twin diesel version and used the same power pack we saw on the M10. This had large grills opening up on the rear deck. The M4A2, of course, was mainly a Lend-Lease tank. The Soviets used it, some of the British got them, and of course the US Marines used them as well, simply because they were the only Shermans that they had available at the time. And the Marines said, well, we'll take these now, please, thank you very much. The M4A3 was a version that had the Ford V8, the GAA, excellent engine, about 500 horse. This became the de facto American tank after the war, saw plenty of service in Korea. This also had large grills on the back, different filler part configuration, of course, because there's only the one engine. The grills were a little bit larger than those on the M4A2. The M4A4 was the one with the wonderful Chrysler 30-cylinder contraption, the A57 multibank. This was the longer engine with the longer engine deck, and your visual identifier was outside. The British really actually liked the M4A4, and we'll be coming to that one in a future story. The M4A6 was another version based off of the M4A4 chassis, so it was also elongated. It had a Caterpillar multi-fuel radial engine. However, only 75 of those were built, and they only ever saw service in the US. So if you see a tank with spaced road wheels, and it's actually on operation in Europe, it's British probably, but it's certainly an M4A4. There was the M4A5 designation, which you will note I have skipped. The M4A5 is what the Americans called the Ram. Quite why they did that, I don't know, because the Ram was really an M3 based vehicle. If you look at the builder's plate of this Grizzly, it actually says Montreal Locomotive Works M4A1. So perhaps that's why they didn't come up with a separate designation for the Grizzlies themselves. Okay, so to get the engine deck up, which is a two-man job, I have summoned my beautiful assistant here, Meathead. This is a moment of fame now to the Inside the Hatch audience. If you don't know him, he's popular enough on the NA community side of things. So if you give me a hand here, please.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That was heavy.
Go away. So now we have the engine bay open. You can see the Continental as it is installed inside the tank. It's mounted on the brackets. There are 4 large bolts that are holding it in place. So if you wanted to pull the engine out, you'll undo the deck, lift that out of the way, lift up the engine by, of course, disconnecting the power shaft, fuel lines, and what have you. This particular engine will get the tank up to a burst speed of 24 miles an hour and a sustained speed of about 21. Of course, this was the weakest of the engine options. Later versions of the tank would go a little bit faster, up to 30. You can also see in here the red pipes for the fire extinguisher system. This was a 2-shot system. You could be fired from either inside the tank or by use of the handle on the engine deck just left rear of the turret. Further forward, under its own fuel tank port, is the auxiliary motor. This, of course, would be used for running the systems without draining the main fuel tanks and, of course, putting wear and tear on the main engine. Speaking of fuel, the fuel in this system would be 168 gallons. That would be about enough to get you 120 miles. Some help he was. I mean, I told him to go away, but he took it literally. Well, that brings us to the end of part 1, and of course part 2 will be the interior positions, which we will get to at a later date. I'll see you then. Later, vehicles showed up with a new suspension. Hello, Spider. Are you having fun? I'm going to skip forward a little bit, though, very quickly to sometime in 1943. Wait, one.
I imagine that music would be played over this part anyway.
You're going to be relocated from the Sherman to the T-34.